911 dispatchers, what has been your most creepy, unnerving call? Please like and subscribe to support this channel. Christmas night. 911 call with crying child on the other end. A neighbor had ran her car over her mom during a domestic. The mom crawled to the porch bleeding and the child saw the car coming back. I had her hide quietly in a closet with the cordless phone. The 10-year-old child was crying and screamed that she hated Christmas. She was afraid of the police when they got there. I kept her on the phone until she felt safe enough to give the phone to an officer. I almost fainted after that call was over. Had nightmares for a while. My family member is a longtime first responder and retired into doing dispatch. He heard the address, someone else was taking the call, and realized it was his daughter's house. He rushed over there just in time to see them wheeling her body out. Overdose. 5 months later, he was called to his ex-wife's place because his grandson, son of the daughter who recently passed, had his door locked, lights on, but wasn't responding to his grandma. He broke the door down and found him deceased in bed. Overdose. He's very stoic after years of all sorts of traumatic situations, but my heart hurts whenever I think of what all of this must have felt like. Like sand through your fingers. My mom is a 911 dispatcher. Early on, she said one Christmas Eve while working she got a call from an elderly lady whose husband had just collapsed and died from a heart attack, and in the background Alvin and the Chipmunks Christmas music was playing on blast. The lady was screaming and crying and begging for her husband to wake up, but my mom could hear his gurgling in his last breaths. She doesn't listen to or watch Alvin and the Chipmunks since. Not a dispatcher, but I used to work for a 211 service. Like police handle law services. A lot of other services can be found by calling 211, such as looking for employment offices, food, housing shelters, etc. We occasionally would get suicide callers, people who wanted someone to listen to them, elderly who needed to chat, people with mental instabilities, and a lot of domestic violence calls. We get a lot of them because calling 211 is a lot different than 911, so we've been trained to ask questions such as finding out where they are, who they're with, etc. So that when we connect the call to police we can quickly give them all the information there and then. A lot of times we'll get badly abused women who are just looking for a shelter or somewhere to go, especially late at night. It was a very hard job to do since I worked overnight. Anyways, we had trainings where we would listen to recorded audios. We usually always record our phone calls for legal and training reasons, and one of the trainings was a suicide one. I remember specifically being trained that, sometimes you can't save someone, and that's not your fault. My trainer played a cell phone call for me where he was talking to a young man who walked onto a train track. And the trainer was trying to get information from him on where he was and to get him off the track. Sadly, the only things you hear is the trainer pleading the guy to not do it, and then the train comes in loud, the cell phone plays for a bit, and then the call ends. I couldn't imagine doing that job. Coming home in the morning and seeing on the news how I failed someone like that. But I did the job for a summer and then left cause it was very draining on me. During the academy, a radio call recording was played. A man had just shot his wife in front of his children, 2 kids under 7 years old. The dispatcher hears him calmly say he killed his wife and children crying in the background. Gurgling is heard and he tells the dispatcher to please wait. A gunshot is heard and the poor kids let out blood-curdling screams. The first bullet didn't kill her and he heard her struggling to breathe and shot her again. She died. He gave up easily, and only good thing is the kids were not shot or physically harmed. Former 911 operator. 2 calls that have stuck with me. 1. Call from a woman whose husband had locked himself in the garage and dumped gasoline everywhere and was now threatening to light himself on fire. I dispatched everything, police, fire, ambulance. Despite there not really being a need for an all-hands response. Seconds after I sent the tones out, the guy lit everything up. There is a very distinctive noise that a large volume of gasoline makes when it ignites. I can still hear it all. 2. Coworker got a call from a frantic woman. Husband had barricaded himself down in the basement with multiple weapons and was despondent. Wife was handicapped, she couldn't really move. I believe she might have been wheelchair-bound, if I recall correctly. Things aren't going well on the call. Coworker call me over to patch in, basically listen to the call silently and offer advice, ideas to the original call taker. Point 2 heads are better than 1 kinda thing. There's a loud boom on the phone. Really loud. Unfortunately, my coworker didn't really have the same familiarity with guns as I do. I knew instantly what had happened. He had pulled the trigger. The police had been dispatched already. And as there were weapons involved, the response was huge. Roads closed, perimeters established, the works. They even ended up calling an ERT. The standoff lasted hours, and the guy was dead the entire time. And his wife was upstairs completely unaware of it, because we managed to lie about what it could have been and she believed us. And it gets worse. She had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. And he couldn't handle the news. Not a dispatcher myself, but I just wanted to come here to say all of you dispatchers are unsung heroes. You can somehow stay professional when getting yelled at and stay calm when you have a caller hysterical on the other end of the line and help talk them through. Then you go home at the end of your shift and have to replay what you've heard over and over a lot of the time without any mental health support of your own. Never forget, you are our heroes that help us through our darkest days, and heroes sometimes need a little help too. Reach out to someone if you need it, hold strong and keep being awesome. I worked on an ambulance for 10 years as both an EMT and paramedic. I've been in dispatch for the past 3 years. I gotta say, it's a different animal. On the ambulance, when I arrive on an emergency scene, one of my priorities was controlling the scene, so I can do what I needed to do. I had lots of ways to do so, and tailored it to the situation on hand. In dispatch, all I have is my voice to help control the situation. It's a different skill set for sure. One call that sticks with me is a woman called because a dog attacked and mauled her son. She had grabbed her son and jumped into their car in their driveway to escape the dog. It was still barking outside the vehicle. Her son had basically been scalped by the dog. Very tough to listen to her try and hold herself together while waiting for help to arrive. People don't call us on their best days, and don't always like it when we start asking questions. We listen to them take their last breaths, console them after being raped, and tell them help is coming when they run out of their blood pressure meds and think their blood pressure is high. All in a day's work. My uncle passing away. Worked as a small town dispatcher for a year or so. Had a bunch of messed up stuff happen on shift, but this call came in the still hours of the night. Small town, so not many calls after midnight. I answered and recognized the name and address on caller ID. Aunt was in a frenzy, so didn't recognize my voice. I remained calm and got M's and fire rolling to them, but by my aunt's own words, he was already blue. I went through debriefing and mandated therapy for a couple other things that happened, but never really talked to anyone about this. I just try not to think about it. That was the call I figured out I needed to find a different job. Back in the day when my dad was a police officer, different counties didn't use the same 10 codes, i.e. 10-4, 10-9, etc. This came into play when he was handling a minor traffic accident in an intersection right on the border of our county and the next one over. Literally, the line runs down the middle of the street. My dad's on the scene immediately, and radios into our county saying he's handling an accident at the intersection. He then switches over to the other county's frequency and says he's handling a minor accident and they should send someone out. Except he gave the 10 code for a minor collision. Almost immediately he hears sirens start up from every direction, moving towards him fast. Asterisk, first couple cars come flying into the intersection and officers roll out of their cars, guns drawn. And my dad's like, yo, WTF. One officer walks up to my dad like, what happened? And my dad's like, it's a fender bender, like I said. Turns out the 10 code for a fender bender in our county is the send in the cavalry because they're shooting everybody over here, distress call for theirs. Many changes were made. A woman called in once, saying she had already swallowed a massive amount of pills. Later found it was over 100 oxycodone, about 40 Xanax, and a mix of about 20 other pills, and was okay with dying. She told me not to send any help, and that she was fine. Just wanted someone to talk to her until she passed. She then stated if I sent any people, and if she heard any sirens or knocks on her door, she would light herself on fire as she had already doused herself in lighter fluid. At my job, there is no choice to not send help. I have to enter a call. So I did. How the field handles it themselves, given the information I've provided, is up to them. As units were heading there, I was speaking to her, listening to her continuously flicking her lighter, knowing at any moment she could set herself ablaze. After about 4 minutes, which felt like an eternity, she asks if I sent people to her. To which I replied that she had called 911 and 911 was there to help her. I didn't want her to harm herself, I cared about her, and she could get the help she needed. She then asked again, did you send people here? I froze, not knowing what to say. Then, after a few seconds of silence, she eerily chuckled, said, "I knew you would. And that's okay. I forgive you. Please forgive me," then proceeded to set herself on fire. I listened to her blood-curdling screams as she burned. I still hear that lighter flicking sometimes. I can still hear her chuckle. I still hear her burning screams. I asked a friend this. She worked in it 20+ years and she's an absolute sweet little lady. She told me this one time a neighbor called them to say the apartment building was on fire and there were kids still inside sleeping in the neighboring apartment, but they didn't want to bother checking the door or waking them up not to upset the parents, who were at work. All 6 kids and 2 dogs died that day. She expressed how people are really unwilling to help someone in need when calling sometimes, and it breaks her soul every time. Not a dispatcher, but handle radio communications for the Coast Guard. One night I was on the radio and got a call from an 11-year-old kid whose boat had started to sink. He was out with his dad and 6-year-old brother. They had been hit by another boat and his father got knocked unconscious. I remember the entire conversation up until the radio had gone underwater. They ended up finding his dad floating on his back alive, but the 2 boys didn't make it. That one really fucked with me because my 2 littlest brothers were around the same age as the youngest. When I was 9, my mom died. My brother, 10, 5, and I were home alone with her. Our dad had died 3 years earlier. She had a massive heart attack. My brother called 911 and they walked us through getting her off the bed and onto the floor so that my brother could attempt CPR. When he was ready, he gave me the phone, on speaker, and told me to turn around and face the wall so I didn't have to watch. I vividly remember sobbing to the dispatcher, "Please, you don't understand, this is my last parent. You have to do something." The dispatcher attended my mother's funeral and left the field right after. My brother is a trauma surgeon. I'm in nursing school. Very cataclysmic situation for all involved. The singing suicide man. When I first started, every once in a while we'd get a call from an untraceable number. The man on the other end would be sobbing, just the most heart-wrenching sobs you've ever heard. After a second or two, he'd start singing a song about suicide. He'd interrupt himself every few words with another sob, and every time I tried to ask him a question, he'd loudly break into the chorus, wailing about how suicide is painless. I learned years later that he was singing the theme song from MASH, but it was so off-tune and filled with wails of misery that it was completely unrecognizable. Through random chance, I got most of the singing suicide man's calls. We can't disconnect from calls where we believe someone may be hurt without dispatching help. I couldn't dispatch help because he wouldn't talk to me. I had to sit there, utterly helpless, while a suicidal man sobbed and sang to me about how much he wanted to kill himself. Everyone has a kind of call that they can't handle. I can handle the calls where I have to give CPR instructions over the phone. I can handle parents panicking because their child is severely injured. I can handle someone screaming because they found their parent dead. I have a history of severe depression, and I've been actively suicidal. I can't handle suicidal callers. I know exactly what it feels like. And suicidal callers where you are forced to listen, utterly helpless, sure that any second you're going to hear a gunshot on the other end? That's a room in hell custom made for me. I had a friend who worked as a 911 dispatcher, and he always said the worst call he ever had was a approximately 20-year-old kid who committed suicide by mixing a bunch of chemicals together in his car to produce hydrogen sulfide gas. He said that the most unnerving part was hearing him calmly listing off the chemicals, the type of gas produced, and the effects of hydrogen sulfide on the body, namely the almost instant death it causes at high concentrations. He ended the call by providing the address of the parking lot he was in and saying that nobody should approach the vehicle without hazmat equipment. Apparently after that there was a whooshing sound as he dumped the last chemical into the mix, and then the line went dead silent aside for a quiet fizzing noise. I know that call screwed him up because he almost never talks about stuff that happens to him on the job. He quit a few months later to go into construction management, and frankly I can't blame him. My wife has been a dispatcher for over 10 years. To add to the insanity of the job, in her case, 1. You're just there to handle things until help arrives. You'll have to make connections and do your own research to find out what happened, especially since 2. Many cops in your management can view you as just a secretary, etc. Also, she doesn't share a building with cops, firefighters, EMTs. 3. If you have a particularly disturbing call, or any call, management, who may or may not be able to do your job, can keep replaying the recording to you, as they nitpick. 4. You don't get a break if your caller shoots themselves in the neck. Once help arrives, you're simply expected to disconnect and keep working. The dispatchers in my state are trying to be categorized whereas they can retire in 25 years, due to the stress of the job. No luck, so far. I recently had an open line 911 call, where the person that called was the victim of a home invasion. He was smart enough to call 911 and hide the phone so we could hear everything that was going on. I heard him begging for someone to just take the money and leave. Please don't kill me, I'm an old man. And I heard another male voice in the background swearing, telling him he was going to shoot him in the face. It was the longest phone call of my life. I thought for sure I was going to hear this poor guy get murdered on the line. I was afraid to say anything because I didn't want the suspect to know or hear that the victim had called. Thankfully, our officers got there fairly quickly, surrounded the building and caught the guy trying to go out a back window. He got arrested and the old man survived with only minor injuries from being punched several times. Apparently the suspect was super high and was a friend of a caretaker of the elderly person. The caretaker had mentioned the old man had money hidden in the house. I've talked to people were dying and people who had just watched their loved ones die in violent ways, but the ones that get me are the ones that could have been stopped. A guy who didn't report a domestic in a high-rise for 60 minutes until he saw a girl hurtle past his window on the way to the ground below. A woman whose son said he was going to jump off a bridge. She drove to the bridge she thought he'd go to, and sure enough there he was. She didn't want to block traffic so she drove to the other side to pull over. He jumped before she could run back. Honestly, the call that caused me the absolute most grief was simply an elderly man who woke up to find his wife deceased next to him, having died in her sleep overnight. I'll never forget the pain in his voice. It's weird because there wasn't any crime, any violence, any victim really. He just clearly really loved her and wasn't ready for her to go. I choke up a little thinking about it years later. We had a tidal alarm that would go off at the local marina with some regularity. A popular tourist cruise boat was docked there and it had an independent tidal alarm that would go off if there were sudden changes, as they might indicate that someone had climbed on the boat. We had only the boat one go off one night, so we sent out a unit just to check. The officer that pulled up was pretty sure it was just an error, as they often were for the port alarm. He boarded the vessel anyway with the station master, and they went about searching the boat. He called in to report that it was clear just as he reached the last bathroom, but as he was talking over the radio he said the door wouldn't open. Then he heard someone running through the boat. I ended up dispatching K9 units, helicopters, and a ton of other units to the scene, and they spent the entire night out there with that thing under spotlights, as there turned out to be 4 to 5 people hiding on the boat who were in the midst of stealing stuff when the unit arrived. I heard a lot of awful stuff over the phones, and was there for multiple officer downs and an end of watch before going to graduate school. But this boat incident happened in my first week on the phones and it really made an impression on me to hear the fear in that officer's voice. People forget that these guys get asked to do a hell of a lot. A guy who I used to practice martial arts with was a fire investigator, and he was put on the Grenfell Tower case, and part of the investigation was to listen to all the phone calls made to try and work out how many people were inside at the time of the fire. And as he was talking about listening to people's final phone call, you could just see his eyes do that 1,000-yard stare. You've got to admire anyone in that line of work who don't just walk out and leave. As a side question to any 911 dispatchers, does anyone know if the Ruth Price phone call from the 80s, 90s is real, or was that just done for training purposes? Because I've tried looking online for details about it but can't find anything that proves or disproves it. Not creepy or unnerving but kinda sad. I worked in a small jail in my hometown for a while and our control center was also 911 dispatch. Since we only had one dispatcher, I often assisted in coordinating larger efforts. We received a call about a body of an unidentified male in the river and I helped coordination efforts with search and rescue to recover it. Our jail also had the morgue located in the building, and during such events I often also received the body, transferred it from the ambulance to our gurney, and placed the corpse in storage until the coroner or funeral home employee arrived to perform an examination or to collect it for the funeral home. The body arrived and I identified who it was: Emi Diatley. It was my old high school friend. He had gotten into drugs and fell in with a bad crowd. His drug use had led to an overdose which caused brain damage, and he would often have seizures accompanied psychotic outbursts. I had ceased hanging out with him about a year earlier because of his increasingly erratic behavior. One such episode had occurred at a party and several partygoers had beaten him unconscious. The story then gets a bit hazy from there. Either his friends tried to wake him and couldn't, so panicked and threw him in the river where he drowned, or he awoke still combative and was then thrown into the river as a result of the ensuing fight. Either way, he was brutally beaten and then drowned by other partygoers. Because the county was very small and he was just another dead junkie, nobody looked into his death very hard and nobody ever saw charges. I know who did it because of my own digging, and it's basically an open secret in town that 3 individuals involved killed him.